50,000 Romans, 140,000 Cimbri, northern Italy, July 30th, 101 BC. The numbers sound impossible, but the corpses in the rotting plain spoke louder than any doubt. Between 120 and 114 BC, the North Sea swallowed whole coastlines around Jutland. Storm surges slammed into the peninsula. The land disappeared under salt water. Thousands drowned. The survivors moved south. They called themselves Cimbri. Their neighbors, the Teutones, joined them, then the Ambrones. This was no raiding party. This was migration written in desperation. Women, children, carts packed with everything they owned. A flood set them in motion, and Rome sat directly in their path. 113 BC. The Cimbri reached Noricum in modern Austria. The Tarissi tribes there were Roman allies. Consul Gnaeus Papirius Carbo took 2 legions north to push them back. At Nerea, he found them. The Cimbri were negotiating. Carbo offered guides to help them leave peacefully. Pure treachery. His guides led the Cimbri on a longer route, while Carbo moved his legions to ambush them from behind. The Cimbri discovered the trap. They turned and attacked. Carbo's army was annihilated. Only a sudden thunderstorm stopped the complete destruction. The survivors scattered back to Italy carrying stories of giants with blue eyes and weapons that shattered Roman shields. Rome expected invasion. The Cimbri moved west into Gaul instead. 109 BC. Consul Marcus Junius Silanus met them with another army, another defeat. 107 BC. The Tigerini allies of the Cimbri destroyed a Roman force at Burdigala, modern Bordeaux, and killed Consul Lucius Cassius Longinus Revala. 105 BC. October 6th, near Arosio, modern Orange, on the Rhone River. Rome sent its largest force since the Second Punic War. Over 80,000 legionaries. Consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus commanded one army. Proconsul Quintus Servilius Caepio commanded the other. Caepio was aristocrat. Maximus was common-born. Caepio refused to take orders from a man beneath his social class. The 2 armies camped on opposite sides of the river, separate, divided, vulnerable. The Cimbri under King Boiorix and the Teutones under King Teutobod attacked. Caepio moved first without support, trying to claim glory for himself alone. The Germans surrounded his force and slaughtered it. Then they turned on Maximus. His army watched their comrades die across the river. Morale broke before the battle began. Their backs were to the Rhone. When they tried to flee, many drowned in their armor. 80,000 legionaries dead, 40,000 servants and camp followers killed, 120,000 total casualties, worse than Cannae, the worst defeat in Roman history. Both of Maximus's sons died in the fighting. The young Quintus Sertorius survived by swimming the Rhone fully armed. Terror Cimbricus, the terror of the Cimbri. Rome expected them at the gates any moment. The Senate suspended normal law. Gaius Marius was elected consul for 104 BC, then 103. Then 102, then 101, 5 consecutive consulships, unprecedented, illegal in peacetime. But these were not normal times. The Cimbri gave Marius the gift of time. Instead of invading Italy, they turned toward Spain. They spent 105 to 103 BC raiding the peninsula with mixed success. Marius used every hour. He rebuilt the Roman army from nothing. Property requirements for military service had traditionally limited who could serve. Soldiers needed to own land to buy their own equipment. Marius threw that requirement away. He recruited from the capit censi, the landless poor. He armed them with state weapons, 30,000 Romans, 40,000 Italian allies, 70,000 total. He trained them harder than any Roman force before. Daily drills, forced marches carrying their own gear. The soldiers called themselves Marius's mules. Each man carried 33 to 44 kilograms on his back. They marched 37.5 kilometers per day. No massive baggage trains slowing them down, no vulnerable supply columns for enemies to attack. The legion became a mobile fortress. Marius organized them into cohorts of 480 men instead of the older maniple system. He made the eagle the universal standard, one legion. One purpose. Discipline that turned farmers and laborers into professional killers. 102 BC. The Germanic tribes returned from Spain. They split their forces. The Teutones and Ambrones would invade Italy from the northwest through Gaul. The Cimbri and their Tigerini and Toigini allies would attack from the northeast through the Alps. Marius took his trained army to face the western column. His co-consul, Quintus Lutatius Catulus, took 20,000 to 24,000 men to guard the Alpine passes. Marius established his base at Aquae Sexti, modern Aix-en-Provence. The Teutones and Ambronese approached along the Rhone. They found Marius camped on high ground with fortifications that would make assault suicide. For 3 days, they attacked his camp. Every assault failed. Frustrated, they decided to bypass him and march for Italy. Plutarch says it took 6 full days for their entire host to pass Marius's camp. The warriors taunted the Romans. What messages did they want sent to their wives? Marius shadowed them, always camping in strong positions, always keeping rough terrain between his force and theirs, never giving them the battle they wanted on their terms. Near Aquae Sextiae, the moment came. Roman servants went to the river for water. They found Ambrones bathing on the opposite bank. A skirmish erupted. The Ambrones called for reinforcements. They came drunk from dinner. Marius's Ligurian auxiliaries heard the Ambrones shouting their tribal name as a battle cry. The Ligurians shouted back. It was an ancient name in their own language. They charged. The battle spread. The Ambrones fought back across the river. The Romans drove them up the slope. Thousands of Ambrones died. The survivors fled to their Teuton allies. 4 days passed. Marius prepared. He sent his legate Claudius Marcellus with 3,000 men into the woods on his flank, hidden, silent, waiting for the signal. On the 4th day, Marius marched his infantry out of camp and formed at the top of the hill. His cavalry rode down to the plains to harass the Teutons. The trap was set. King Teutobod took the bait. The Teutons charged uphill toward the Roman position. The climb exhausted them. The narrow space between ravines compressed their superior numbers into a killing zone. The sun beat down. These were northern warriors, used to cold climates. The heat drained them. The Romans stood in close order at the summit, shields locked, javelins ready. The Teutons reached the Roman line. Pila flew in volleys. Hundreds fell. The survivors crashed into the shield wall. The Romans held. For hours they fought, neither side breaking. The disciplined legionaries slowly forced the Teutons back down the hill. When both forces reached level ground, Marcellus attacked from the rear. 3,000 fresh Romans hit the exhausted Teutons from behind. Confusion, panic. The shield wall collapsed. The Teutons broke and ran for their camp. The Romans followed. 90,000 Teutons and Ambrones died. 20,000 were captured, including King Teutobod in chains. Among the captured were 300 Teuton noblewomen. They begged Marius to let them serve in the temples of Ceres and Venus. He refused. That night they killed their children. By morning they had strangled each other. Mass suicide rather than slavery. Roman historians recorded it as Germanic heroism. The price of defeat was total. One threat eliminated. The Cimbri remained. Catullus faced them in the northeast Alps. His 20,000 men tried to hold the passes. The Cimbri were over 100,000 warriors, not counting women and children. Catullus attempted to defend the Adige River with fortifications on both banks and a bridge connecting them. The Cimbri dammed the river upstream. They sent heavy objects floating down to destroy the bridge. Many Romans panicked and abandoned their positions. Catullus retreated. Some of his cavalry fled all the way to Rome, spreading more terror. The Cimbri crossed the Alps into the Po Valley. Northern Italy lay open before them. But they paused. They ravaged the fertile lands. They took their time. That delay saved Rome. Marius arrived from Gaul with his victorious legions from Aquae Sextiae. He assumed overall command, his 5th consulship. By July 101 BC, the combined Roman force of 50 to 54,000 men moved to meet the Cimbri near Placentia. Negotiations began. The Cimbri demanded land to settle. Marius refused. He had the captured Teuton kings paraded before them to prove their allies were destroyed. King Boiorix of the Cimbri challenged Marius directly. Set the time and place for battle. Marius agreed. 3 days. The routing plain near Vercellae. Wide open ground, perfect for cavalry. Perfect for the superior Roman discipline to shine. The location is debated. Most scholars place it near modern Vercelli in Piedmont on the Sesia River, where it meets the Po. Some argue Vercellae might mean any mining area at the confluence of 2 rivers. Artifacts found at Borgo Vercelli, 5 kilometers from Vercelli, support the traditional site. Another theory places it near Rovigo in the Pole Sign or at Rodi in Cuneo province. The ancient sources agree on the date, July 30th, 101 BC. Shortly after noon, Marius divided his army strategically. His 30 to 32,000 experienced veterans formed the wings. Catullus and his 20 to 24,000 less experienced troops held the center. Lucius Cornelius Sulla commanded the cavalry on the right wing. The Cimbri fielded between 120,000 and 180,000 warriors. Some sources claim 200,000, counting everyone, including women and children in camp. The numbers seemed impossible, but the Cimbri had absorbed other tribes during their migration. The Boii, the Tigerini, the Toigini, their ranks had swelled. Morning mist covered the plain. The Cimbric cavalry advanced first, then they swerved right, trying to draw the Roman infantry into the gap between their cavalry and infantry. A classic feint. Marius saw through it, but his men were already moving to close the trap. The infantry started charging after the cavalry. The Cimbric infantry then advanced straight at the Roman center. Marius and Catulus paused to make sacrifices. The auguries predicted victory. They advanced into the attack. Plutarch's account here strains belief. He claims Marius's men got lost in dust clouds so thick they spent the battle wandering the plain and missed most of the fighting. This makes little sense. You cannot lose 140,000 enemy warriors in dust. If dust was that thick, the sun could not blind anyone. The sun becomes the next factor. It shone directly into the Cimbric faces. This blinded them and the heat exhausted them, but the Cimbri had spent years campaigning in southern Gaul and Spain. They knew heat. The story serves Roman propaganda more than tactical analysis. What is documented? Catulus' center bore the heaviest fighting. The Cimbri crashed into his lines with massive numerical advantage. The fighting was brutal, face to face. The front Cimbric ranks were chained together to prevent breaking. They would hold or die together. The Roman cohorts fought with discipline drilled into them over 2 years. Pilum volleys thinned the Cimbric ranks. When one of Marius's javelins struck a Cimbric shield, the wooden peg he had designed broke. The iron shank bent, and the javelin hung from the shield, making it useless. The Cimbri had to drop their shields or fight with weapons dangling from them. Either way, they were more vulnerable to the gladius. The Roman lines held, then pushed forward, inch by inch. The Cimbri began to give ground. Their superior numbers meant nothing in the compressed killing zone. Sulla's cavalry on the right smashed through the Cimbric horsemen. The Roman cavalry wheeled and struck the Cimbric infantry from behind. Encircled, no escape. King Boiorix and his nobles made their last stand. They died where they stood. The rest broke and fled for their camp. The slaughter continued. The Cimbric women rushed from the camp with weapons. They fought the Romans with desperate fury. They killed their own children to spare them from slavery. When defeat became certain, they killed themselves. The carnage was total. Roman sources claim 140,000 Cimbri died. Some say 120,000. Others say 90,000 to 100,000 warriors alone. 60,000 were captured. Women, children, the old, all sold into slavery. Some of those children years later became gladiators in the Third Servile War, the Spartacus Rebellion. If you value documented Roman military history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from Plutarch's Life of Marius, written around 100 AD based on earlier Roman histories. The Perioca summaries of Livy's lost books covering the Cimbrian War compiled from 1st century BC accounts. Orosius's histories against the pagans from the early 5th century AD drawing on Livy and other sources, and archaeological evidence from Borgo Vercelli, including weapons and skeletal remains, dated to the period published in Zenari's 1958 study, La Battaglia dei Vercelli. Now back to the information. The battlefield told its own story. Citizens from nearby Parma walked the Raudine plain after the battle. They saw Cimbric corpses everywhere. Many still had Roman pila embedded in them. Catulus brought these witnesses to Rome to prove his legions had done most of the killing, not just Marius's veterans. The pila markings showed which units struck which warriors. Catulus demanded recognition. Marius claimed overall credit as supreme commander, which was his right. The dispute turned bitter. Eventually they held a joint triumph through Rome. Marius received most of the glory as the overall commander. The Senate and people hailed him as the third founder of Rome after Romulus and Camillus. He had saved the Republic from its worst threat since Hannibal. Politics shifted immediately. Marius had been elected consul for 100 BC as well, his 6th consulship. But the reason for his unprecedented string of 5 consecutive consulships was gone. The Germanic threat was eliminated. His political enemies regained power. His influence began to fade despite his massive popularity. More dangerous was what came next. After the battle, Marius granted Roman citizenship to 2 cohorts of his Italian allied soldiers, about 1,000 men. He did this without consulting the Senate, without permission. When senators questioned him, he claimed that in the din of battle he could not distinguish between the voice of law and the voice of a Roman or an ally. This was revolutionary. A general openly defying the Senate, setting a precedent. Generals could reward their troops directly. Soldiers became clients of their commanders, not servants of the state. The Marian reforms had created professional soldiers who served for 16 years or more. They had no land to return to. They needed their generals to secure retirement benefits, land grants in conquered territories, money. The bond between general and soldier became stronger than the bond between soldier and Rome. Marius and Sulla competed for credit at Vercellae. Sulla had commanded the decisive cavalry charge on the right wing. He never forgot Marius trying to diminish his role. That rivalry festered. By 88 BC, Sulla would march his legions on Rome itself. The first time a Roman general led troops into the city against Roman authority. Julius Caesar Marius' nephew would cross the Rubicon with his legion in 49 BC, starting the civil war that ended the Republic. The seeds were planted at Vercellae, not in the battle itself, but in what came after. The professional army, loyal to generals, not the state, the precedent of military power overriding political authority. The Cimbri did not vanish completely. Small remnants survived in northern Jutland. When Tiberius's fleet explored the northern coasts in 5 AD, they found the Cimbri still living there. Tacitus mentions them in his Germania, written around 98 AD. He calls them a small state, rich in memories. Their great migration had ended in annihilation, but the name survived. Their boy allies who had joined them settled in southern Gaul and Germania. Julius Caesar encountered their descendants during his campaigns in Gaul 50 years after Vercellae. The battle established doctrine that lasted centuries: the cohort system, uniform equipment, the pilum with its breakable design, the gladius and scutum, disciplined formations in 2 or 3 lines, cavalry on the wings, the volleys of javelins followed by the shield wall charge. This was how Rome would fight from Spain to Syria to Britain. The superiority was undeniable. 50,000 Romans destroyed 140,000 Cimbri, not through numbers, but through training discipline and tactical superiority. The legion had become the most effective fighting force in the ancient world. The heat at Vercellae may have helped. The sources emphasize it. July afternoon in northern Italy, the sun reflecting off polished Roman shields and helmets. The Cimbri, accustomed to northern climates, would have suffered more than Romans used to Mediterranean heat. Experimental reconstructions of the battle conditions suggest temperatures on the plain could have reached 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, heavy enough to cause heat exhaustion in warriors wearing fur and fighting uphill into the sun. Every advantage mattered when facing 3-to-1 odds. The dust Plutarch mentions was probably real, even if his story about Marius getting lost is propaganda. Thousands of men and horses moving across a dry plain in summer would kick up massive dust clouds. Visibility would drop. The chaos would intensify. But disciplined cohorts trained to maintain formation, even blind, would hold together. The Cimbric warriors without the same drill would fragment. The dust would hurt them more than the Romans. The camp massacre was systematic. After breaking the Cimbric army on the field, the Romans assaulted the camp. The women fought back with axes and swords and anything they could grab. Roman sources describe the ferocity, but numbers and armor prevailed. The legionaries cut through them. Then came the grim work of taking prisoners, separating those worth selling as slaves, executing the wounded and the old. By evening, the camp was silent except for Roman voices. 60,000 captives. Most were women and children. The slave markets in Rome and across Italy filled with Cimbric prisoners. Wealthy Romans bought them as household slaves. Some became gladiators. The children grew up in slavery, never knowing their homeland or their people's proud migration. A generation erased. The flood that started the Cimbric migration around 120 BC ended on a blood-soaked plain 2 decades later. Every step south had led to this. The victories at Neraea, Arausio, Bertigala, all of it came to nothing at Vercellae. The migration that threatened to destroy Rome instead destroyed itself. One detail haunts the aftermath. When archaeologists excavated sites near Borgo Vercelli in the 1950s, they found mass burial pits, hundreds of skeletons, many with trauma consistent with combat wounds, pilum tips embedded in bone, skulls crushed by gladius strikes. The remains were dated to the late 2nd century BC. The location matches the ancient descriptions of the battlefield. Among the bones, they found items that appeared Germanic, fibulae brooches, iron spearheads with distinctive shapes, fragments of shields with Celtic designs. The physical evidence matches the literary sources. The slaughter was real. The scale was genuine. 140,000 is not propaganda. The bodies in the pits confirm it. The Raudian plain drank Roman blood at Arausio. 80,000 legionaries, 40,000 support troops, 120,000 total. 4 years later at Vercellae, it drank Cimbric blood. 140,000 warriors, 60,000 captives, 200,000 counting the camp followers who died. The plain became a graveyard for an entire people. Their migration ended not in new lands, but in total extermination. Rome survived. The Cimbri did not. One final number closes the account. Marius' force at Vercellae lost fewer than 1,000 men. Some estimates put Roman casualties as low as 300. The disparity is staggering. 50,000 against 140,000. Final tally. Romans lost under 1,000. Cimbri lost over 100,000 on the field and 60,000 into slavery. The calculation is brutal. This was not a battle. This was an execution. Professional soldiers with 2 years of the hardest training ever given to a Roman army against migrating warriors exhausted from 20 years of wandering. The outcome was inevitable once Marius chose the ground and the time. Discipline defeated desperation. training defeated numbers. Rome defeated the North. The mass grave at Borgo Vercelli holds the answer to why Rome won. Forensic analysis of the skeletal trauma shows most wounds are frontal. The Cimbri did not die running, they died fighting. But the killing blows came from short-bladed weapons at close range. Gladius wounds. The victims faced their killers. They stood their ground, and they died anyway because facing a Roman legion in close combat meant death. The chained front ranks could not retreat. They had to hold. The Romans simply killed them all, then moved to the next line. Methodical. Efficient, the way you slaughter cattle. Catulus never forgot that he and his 20,000 held the center while Marius claimed all the glory. In his later years, he spoke bitterly about it, but the Pelum evidence was incontrovertible. His men had done most of the killing. Marius's veterans on the wings had prevented flanking maneuvers. Sulla's cavalry had delivered the knockout blow from behind, but Catulus's center had stood against the main Cimbric assault and bled them white. History gave Marius the credit. Catulus got a joint triumph and political obscurity. Such are the rewards for those who fight beside giants. The Cimbric women who killed their children and themselves entered Roman legend. Writers centuries later used them as examples of barbarian honor and maternal devotion. Jerome in 409 AD wrote about them. The story passed into Christian martyrology as an example of choosing death over dishonor. The irony is sharp. Romans killed hundreds of thousands and enslaved 60,000. But they remembered with respect the 300 noble women who refused to be sold. Propaganda works both ways. Vercelli ended the Cimbrian War. 13 years from first contact at Neraea to final annihilation on the Raudine Plain. The war cost Rome over 150,000 soldiers at Neraea, Bertigala, and Arausio combined. It triggered constitutional crisis, 5 consecutive consulships from Marius, military reforms that changed the army forever, client armies loyal to generals, the groundwork for civil war. All of it traced back to a flood in Jutland around 120 BC. Storm surge, migration, clash with Rome, extinction. 20 years of wandering erased in one afternoon. The sun set over Vercellae on July the 30th, 101 BC. The Raudine Plain was carpeted with Cimbric dead. Roman soldiers walked among the bodies collecting weapons and stripping armor. Catulus's men pulled their pila from corpses to prove which unit had made which kills. The camp smoldered. 60,000 prisoners sat bound under guard waiting to be marched to slave markets. The migration was over. The Cimbri were finished. Rome had survived its greatest test since Hannibal. But the cost would come later when generals realized their soldiers were more loyal to them than to the Senate. When Sulla marched on Rome, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, when the Republic drowned in its own blood the same way the Cimbri drowned at Vercellae. The flood that started in the North Sea ended at the Po. But it set in motion another flood, one of civil war and military dictatorship that would not end until Augustus closed the Temple of Janus and called himself first citizen while holding all the power. At Borgo Vercelli, near the Sesia River, 5 kilometers from modern Vercelli, they found more than bones. They found a boundary stone, carved, weathered, ancient. The inscription was worn but readable. It marked the edge of the Raudine Plain, the place where the Cimbri made their final stand. The stone had stood there for 2,000 years, marking a graveyard. The archaeologists left it in place. Some things should not be moved. Some places should not be forgotten. The Cimbri came from the sea. They died by the Po. The stone remembers. The bones remember. 50,000 Romans destroyed 140,000 Cimbri because Rome had become a machine for killing. And machines do not stop until someone breaks them. The Republic would break, but not yet. Not at Vercellae. There Rome still stood, still strong. Still believing the legions served Rome and not the generals who led them. That belief died slower than the Cimbri, but die it did. The javelins that killed at Vercellae would kill in Rome's streets soon enough. The eagles that flew over German corpses would fly over Roman corpses before the century ended. Vercellae was Rome's greatest victory, and the beginning of its longest defeat. The victory on the Raudine Plain was total. The terror Cimbricus was over. Gaius Marius returned to Rome not as a general, but as a god. The Senate hailed him as the third founder of Rome, placing his name beside Romulus and Camillus. In the year 100 BC, he held his 6th consulship. The people who had feared annihilation now celebrated the man who had delivered them, but the threat that had unified Rome was gone. The emergency powers that had allowed Marius his unprecedented 5 consecutive commands were no longer justified. The hero who saved the Republic had to become a politician again, and the army he had created to destroy the Cimbri would soon destroy the state that built it. The Marius's mules were still camped outside the city, 70,000 veterans. They were not the citizen farmers of the old Republic. They were the capitae sensi, the landless poor. They had served for years. They had marched thousands of kilometers. They had won Rome's greatest victories at Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae, and they had nowhere to go. They owned no farms to return to. Their loyalty was not to the Senate. Their loyalty was to the general who had armed them, trained them, and promised them a reward. They wanted payment. They wanted land. Marius knew he had to deliver. The Senate, led by the Optimates, who despised him as a new man and feared his power, refused to grant the land. They saw the danger. Granting land meant admitting that a general, not the state, was responsible for the soldiers' welfare. Marius turned to the popular assembly. He formed an alliance with the tribune Lucius Apuleius Saturninus and the praetor Gaius Servilius Glaucia. They were radicals. They were dangerous. But they could pass the laws Marius needed. Saturninus proposed the land bills. He used Marius's veterans to intimidate the voters. The soldiers flooded the forum, armed not with the gladius, but with the vote and the threat of violence. When senators tried to veto the proceedings, they were chased from the city. The laws passed. Marius's men got their land in Gaul, in Sicily, in Africa. The client army was born. The precedent was set. Soldiers now knew their retirement depended entirely on their general's political power. The pilum that broke in the Cimbric shield at Vercellae had also broken the spine of the Republic. But Marius had made a deal with vipers. In 100 BC, Saturninus and Glaucia ran for office again. When their rival for the consulship, Gaius Memmius, was murdered in the street by their gangs, the Senate had enough. They passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, calling on the consuls to save the state. That consul was Gaius Marius. Marius was trapped. He had to choose between the political allies who had paid his veterans and the republic he had sworn to protect. He chose the republic. He led soldiers into the forum to hunt down Saturninus and Glaucia. His former allies fled to the Capitoline Hill. Marius cut off their water. They surrendered. Marius locked them in the Curia Hostilia, the Senate house, promising a fair trial. He wanted to spare them, but the mob, led by angry senators, did not wait. They climbed onto the roof, ripped off the tiles, and stoned Saturninus and his followers to death inside the Senate's own building. Marius had saved Rome from the Cimbri. He had saved Rome from Saturninus, but he had destroyed himself. The nobles hated him for his reforms and his 6 consulships. The populares hated him for betraying Saturninus. His political career was over. The hero of Vercellae, the third founder of Rome, quietly left the city in 98 BC. He traveled east to Asia Minor under the pretext of fulfilling a vow. It was a self-imposed exile. He was looking for a new war to make himself relevant again. The poison planted at Vercellae continued to spread. The Italian allies, the Socii Osso, had not forgotten. They had fought in Catullus's center on the Raudin Plain. They had bled and died just as the Romans had. They had seen Marius grant citizenship to 2 cohorts of their men on the battlefield, simply by declaring it so. They wanted the same. They wanted full Roman citizenship. In 91 BC, the tribune Marcus Livius Drusus tried to pass a law granting it. He was assassinated in his own home. The Italians exploded. The social war began. This was not a war against barbarians. This was a war against themselves. The Marsi, the Samnites, the very heart of Italy, rose in revolt. They used Roman weapons. They used Roman tactics. They had been trained by Roman generals. Rome called its best commanders to put down the rebellion. An aging Gaius Marius returned, but his performance was lackluster. The true hero of the social war was his former legate from Vercellae, the man who had commanded the cavalry on the right wing, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. While Marius hesitated, Sulla fought with ruthless efficiency. He captured town after town. He earned the loyalty of his legions. The Senate recognized his skill. The rivalry that had festered in the shadow of Vercellae now had 2 armies behind it. Rome finally ended the war not by winning, but by conceding. In 90 and 89 BC, Rome granted citizenship to all of Italy south of the Po. The precedent Marius had set in the din of battle was now the law, paid for with the blood of 300,000 Italians. The rivalry now became a blood feud. In 88 BC, King Mithridates VI of Pontus invaded Roman Asia. He ordered the massacre of every Roman and Italian in the province. 80,000 civilians died in a single day. The Asiatic Vespers. Rome needed an army. Rome needed a general. The command was the most profitable in memory. The Senate, now favoring Sulla after his victories, gave the command to him. He was consul. It was his right, but Marius, now nearly 70 years old, wanted it. He saw it as his last chance for glory. He allied with a new tribune, Publius Sulpicius Rufus. Sulpicius used street gangs to force the assembly to pass a law transferring the command from Sulla to Marius. Sulla was with his army in Campania, preparing to sail east. When the envoys from Rome arrived to relieve him of command, his soldiers stoned them to death. For them, Sulla was their general. Sulla meant victory. Sulla meant plunder from the rich east. Marius meant nothing. Sulla addressed his 6 legions. He told them Marius would raise a new army and leave them behind, cheated of their reward. He told them the state had been captured by traitors. He ordered them to march on Rome. This was the final consequence of Vercellae, the ultimate expression of the Marian reforms. A Roman general marching his own legions against the city of Rome. His officers refused. They fled. But the soldiers followed Sulla. The client army had chosen its client. Marius and Sulpicius tried to defend the city with a handful of gladiators. It was a joke. Sulla's disciplined cohorts, veterans of the social war, took the streets, block by block. Marius fled for his life, declared an hostis, an enemy of the state. He hid in the swamps of Minturnae. A local magistrate sent a slave to execute him. The slave was a Cimbric warrior, one of the 60,000 captured at Vercellae. When the slave entered the dark hut, he saw the old general. Marius roared, "Men, do you dare kill Gaius Marius?" The Cimbrian dropped his sword and fled, screaming that he could not kill the man who had destroyed his people. Marius escaped to Africa. Sulla secured Rome, passed laws giving power back to the Senate, and finally sailed east to fight Mithridates. He left 2 new consuls in charge for 87 BC. One was his supporter, Gnaeus Octavius. The other was an old Marian, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Sulla was not gone 6 months before Cinna revived the Marian cause. The Senate drove him from the city. Cinna raised an army. And from Africa, Marius returned. He was not the hero of Vercellae. He was a changed man, broken, humiliated, driven by one thing, revenge. He landed in Etruria and raised a private army, offering freedom to slaves who joined him. His mules flocked to his banner. Together, Marius and Cinna besieged Rome. The city starved. The Senate surrendered. Marius entered the city he had saved 13 years earlier, and he unleashed a terror that made the Cimbri look merciful. For 5 days and 5 nights, his soldiers slaughtered his enemies. This was not war. This was butchery. They hunted senators by name. The consul Gnaeus Octavius was killed sitting in his consular chair, dressed in his robes. The head of the orator, Marcus Antonius, was cut off and brought to Marius, who applauded. They hunted down Quintus Lutatius Catulus, Marius's co-consul at Vercellae, the man who had argued over the pilum markings, the man whose center had borne the brunt of the Cimbric charge. Catulus knew Marius would show no mercy. He locked himself in a freshly plastered room, lit a charcoal fire, and died by suffocation. The slaughter only stopped when Marius's general, Quintus Sertorius, the same man who had survived Arausio by swimming the Rhone, could no longer stand the carnage and had his own troops kill Marius's personal bodyguard. Marius had become Boiorix. The savior had become the destroyer. The Rhodine plain had finally come to Rome. In January 86 BC, Marius declared himself consul for an unprecedented 7th time, with Cinna as his colleague. He had achieved his ultimate ambition. He had outdone Sulla. He had destroyed his enemies, 13 days into his consulship. Gaius Marius died. Plutarch says he died of pleurisy, tormented by nightmares that he was still fighting Mithridates. The Republic died with him. Vercellae had been the beginning of the end. The battle proved that a professional army, loyal only to its general, could defeat any enemy. In the years that followed, Sulla would return from the east. He would march on Rome a 2nd time. He would invent the proscription lists, posting the names of thousands of Romans to be killed for reward. He would declare himself dictator, and watching all of it, learning every lesson, was Marius's young nephew, Julius Caesar. The Cimbri had been exterminated, but the Marian reforms they had necessitated had created the weapon that would kill the Republic. The flood that began in the North Sea had finally drowned Rome in its own blood.